Hi and hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lucas Alexander Show. I'm Lucas Alexander in Copenhagen, Denmark. It's the 19th of February, 2024, and my special guest today is an award-winning American newspaper reporter, historian, and editor who is the author of a fascinating new book called The Incredible Life and Mysterious Death of Dorothy Kilgallen, about the famous and celebrated, but also infamous and controversial investigative reporter of crime cases, a journalist, and a gossip columnist. Dorothy Kilgallen became a household name and a national treasure in America in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s until her death in 1965. And she ended up in obscurity after her suspicious and very mysterious death. But in recent years, she has had newfound fame due to the reruns and the online success of the legendary game show, What's My Line? I am here today to discuss that incredible life and that very suspicious death of Dorothy Kilgallen with author Sarah Jordan Heinz.
Well, Dorothy, you've had quite a career since you started as a cub reporter. Did you always really want to follow in the footsteps of your father, Jim Kilgallen, certainly one of the best-known reporters in the country?
I think, Ed, that I probably did self-consciously because I always thought he was the most interesting father on the block. He knew Thomas Edison and Jack Dempsey and John D. Rockefeller and famous actors and actresses, but I didn't consciously think of it until I got an opportunity when I was 17 to get a job, and then 2 weeks on the job and I knew Dad really did have the most fascinating profession.
Good evening from Copenhagen, Denmark, and hello and good noon, I suppose you can say, to Iowa and to our very special guest, Sarah Jordan Heinz. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks for having me.
This is a very exciting and very fascinating and slightly mysterious topic, talking about that great journalist and investigative reporter of crime cases, but also a gossip columnist, Dorothy Kilgallen. In the past, it was probably difficult to overstate her level of fame. She was extremely famous at that time, but right now, a lot of people simply just don't know who she is. But recently, as I said in my introduction, she has found newfound fame due to the online success of the legendary game show, What's My Line? But her death is very fascinating, and that has opened up a can of worms. And you are the author of this great new book called The Incredible Life and Mysterious Death of Dorothy Kilgallen. And Sarah, you are obviously a journalist and reporter yourself, and maybe was a bit inspired by Dorothy Kilgallen. You can tell us a little bit briefly about your own background and history and why Dorothy Kilgallen. This is an ancient case. Why
Mhm.
talk about Dorothy and that case now?
Sure. So I first got interested in Dorothy when I was in high school, and I've always been a bit of an old soul. I love old movies, old music. My parents are baby boomers, so certainly they encouraged it. And I was just talking to my father, Larry, one day, who said, "You would like these old reruns of What's My Line? They're running in the wee hours of the Game Show Network. You should check them out." We watched some episodes. He pointed out Dorothy on the panel and said, "You know, she was an involved in some very high profile cases as a journalist and died under mysterious circumstances. Well, I was pretty intrigued. And at the time, my family published a magazine called Midwest Today. We still have an online presence. And here I am, 16 years old, thinking, let's write a story on Dorothy. She was born in Chicago, although, of course, was a longtime New Yorker. So that was my Midwest connection. And the story was about a year in the works to get the research done, the article written, and it was published in 2007 as Who Killed Dorothy Kilgallen. And, you know, due to my age, obviously being a budding journalist, my father helped me with the interviews. That's when we first got connected with Ron Pataki, who for a lot of people feel like he was involved with her death. And I can certainly speak on that a little bit more later, but they developed quite a long time rapport that I think helped us kind of parse out some information that other authors just didn't have the information about. That article actually named Ron Pataki for the first time in print. Lee Israel had only referred to him as the out-of-towner in her 1979 book on Dorothy, and just some other things that my article exposed. And I became kind of a name in the world of Dorothy Kilgallen with that article. It really gained a lot of traction, especially online. That's kind of how people found me, researchers, other authors. It began with that article.
Wow, that's fascinating. But and before we go into all of those details and go through the as much as we possibly can, because this is, as I said, a can of worms, and there's so much to really cover here. And it's a crime case, and it's so interesting in a way, and they should have done a movie about this. And it's also fascinating that Hollywood has never touched this topic and never done a real proper interesting movie about Dorothy Kilgallen. But talk about Dorothy's mysterious death. Do you believe that she was, in fact, murdered, possibly by the hidden hand, so to speak, the Secret Service, top elite branch of the government who wanted to silence her for being ready to expose the cover-up of the JFK assassination and reveal the real truth behind what really went on there with John F. Kennedy, who became her friend? Was she silenced because she was ready to publish a lot of details that they simply did not want out in the public?
I think it's very possible. And again, I don't know exactly who Ron Pataki was working for. I tend to think he was on CIA payroll just based on some other things I've learned about him. And it could have been a matter of get her notes, get her research material through any means necessary. And they had a confrontation that night, that final night. She was on What's My Line, died a few hours later. And I think it's very likely that they could have had a conversation about the case. She was getting death threats. She was fearing for her life at that stage. And then she's dead a few hours later.
So she was murdered. It was certainly not what they said it was, that she overdosed on what, alcohol and barbiturates.
Mhm. Yeah, so she did die of a drug and alcohol overdose. There were three different barbiturates found in her system. Now, in 1965, forensics was such that you could not differentiate among the three different types. So that came out in the 70s, actually in Lee Israel's book, where she talked about that for the first time. So these were drugs that Dorothy was not known to take. So that added a level of intrigue. And the police officially ruled the death circumstances undetermined. So definitely leaving the door open for homicide. And no one really floated suicide as an idea. And her death certificate does not say accident. It's circumstances undetermined.
But according to her hairdresser, Mark Sinclair, who found her sitting in a bedroom that she never usually used and she never slept in, sitting in an awkward position up in bed with the air conditioning on, very cold in there, maybe to preserve the body, and reading a book upside down with her wig or her hairpiece on and her eyelashes and all of that. It was absolutely suspicious. Can you talk about this scenario? I mean, a lot of people don't even know who she is. Would really love to hear this story because then we can go into the details leading up to what happened that night. She had been on What's My Line on that same night, right?
Yes, yes. So that went out Sunday nights, and then was found the next morning. I think we may never know totally the truth of what happened in that household because I think different people discovered her throughout the day. I know the butler's daughter has claimed her father found Dorothy originally. Maybe he was the one who put her in the bed. That really hasn't been validated as a story. Maybe whoever killed her put her in the bed, but it was not her typical bedroom. It was kind of the room in which guests would maybe lay their coats on when they would visit, kind of the show bedroom. She and her husband did not sleep there. He was on a different floor. And of course, she would have taken off her makeup and hairpiece. You would not just put your nightgown on over your evening clothes. So definitely a staged scene, whether it was staged by her killer or someone in the household wanting to make her death appear less messy or potentially embarrassing, if she'd been found in the bathroom or something. That remains a little uncertain. It kind of depends on who you believe as finding her first. There's not really a consensus when her body was first found. But Mark Sinclair did have his doubts that he was the first to find her. He thought perhaps someone else in the household, the staff or her husband, had found her first. But certainly the way in which she was found bespeaks of someone put her in that bed. It did not seem likely she just simply lay down there and died on her own volition.
The light was on, and she wasn't there. So I turned on my curling irons, and I walked into the bedroom, not thinking that she would be there. And she was sitting up in bed, and I walked over to the bed and touched her, and I knew she was dead right away.
And how was the bed made up?
The bed was spotless. She was dressed very peculiarly. She was dressed like I've never seen her before. She always dressed in pajamas and old socks, and her makeup was off, and her hair was off, and everything was done. She was completely dressed like she was going out. The hair was in place, the makeup was on, the false eyelashes were on, the matching peignoir and robe. Book laid out on the bed, a drink on the table, the light was on, the air conditioning was on. Though you didn't need an air conditioner, you would have had the heat on. And she was always cold. And why she had the air conditioning on, I don't know.
Possibly someone else had turned it on.
Well, maybe to keep the body at a certain temperature,
Was the glass on the bedside table within her reach?
It was on the right-hand side. No, it was way away, way over. And the book, it was turned upside down. It wasn't in the right position for if you'd been reading, laid it down. And it was laid down so perfectly, like that. And one hand, rigor mortis had set in on one hand, the right hand, and it had drawn up the covers a little bit. And there was lipstick on this sleeve of the bolero jacket. And the light was on, and she was sitting up.
Did you ring the intercom for James, the butler?
I went back in the dressing room, picked up the intercom, and rang for James. And I said, "James, I am unable to wake Miss Kilgallen. Could you please come up?" He ran up the stairs. I could hear him. He came up the front stairs, and he ran like he was very excited. And, of course, the door was locked. But I had come in through the back of the door. They didn't expect me to come. I don't think anyone knew I was coming. And this was before 9:30 in the morning. This had to be like 5 after 9. So I opened the door to the bedroom, and James came in. And at that time, I noticed a sheet of paper laying on the floor that had been pushed under the door. And James came in, and he was very flustered. He wasn't himself at all. And I was very upset, so I turned to him and I said, "I'm going home. You can reach me there if you want to." And I left the building, and when I got downstairs and went out the front door, there was a police car sitting in front of the house.
Was the officer in the
There were 2 officers in it.
Just sitting in the car.
Sitting right dead in front of the house, yes.
Did you see them walking through the house at all?
No, they were just in the car. They didn't pay any attention to me when I came out.
Now, she lived near the Russian embassy.
But that was no longer the Russian embassy. They had moved up the street. It was a vacant building at this point.
I see. So, do you find it strange that these police officers did not approach you?
I found it very strange that they were sitting there dead in front of the house. And Dorothy was dead upstairs. Yes, I find it very strange.
But why should somebody in her own household have killed her or murdered her? Or her husband, Richard Colmar, I mean, that everybody knew from that radio show they did together that was successful. Of course, they had had a very troubled marriage, actually, but and we can get into that as well. But the butler, I mean, it would almost be ridiculous, like that old saying, the butler did it. And but he would probably not have done it. And Mark Sinclair, the hairdresser, I mean, he even said that there was a car, a police car outside waiting when he left after 9 o'clock in the morning, when he had discovered, well, Dorothy sitting there dead in that unusual bed, in that bedroom.
Yeah, I certainly don't think anyone in the household killed her. I think it could have just been maybe they put her there and she was found somewhere else. I mean, I think that's a theory, but no, I don't think any of them were involved in her death. It would have been maybe to make it look neater. If there was a drug overdose, obviously some people vomit from that, or there could have been a scene in which they did not want the police to discover her in a way that would not have been very attractive. So there is debate as to who put her in the bed and why.
But she had just left the studio after filming What's My Line. She went into the Regency Hotel to meet Ron Pataki, right? This that
That's an idea.
supposedly was involved with the CIA or the FBI and working for the Secret Service, who pretended to be her boyfriend or younger lover. And she had a difficult time and a difficult relationship also kind of with him, especially if he was pretending and getting a lot of information out from her. And they also suspect that she was poisoned by him at the hotel.
Yes, I think that's likely. Of course, Ron Pataki has denied being there that night. He said they spoke by phone and that was it. But he very easily could have hopped a plane from Columbus, Ohio, and made it out to New York City because, of course, this is pushing, 11 o'clock midnight by the time the show was done. She had actually gone to PJ Clark's with Bob Bach, one of the producers, for kind of a quick drink, almost like she had some time to kill, perhaps. And we definitely know she was seen at the Regency bar with a man. Unfortunately, the police never followed up with maybe a sketch artist or interviewing anyone to see who was this man. But I think a lot of us feel like it was likely Ron Pataki. He was the only man in her life other than her husband. She certainly had a relationship with Johnny Ray off and on for a few years. That would have been obvious if it had been one of them with her that night. They certainly would have come forward. So I think it's likely it was Ron Pataki. And I think they had probably some type of angry confrontation over him being, I guess you could say, an informant, recruited to keep her under surveillance. And I think it's likely he killed her then.
And somebody was with him maybe to bring her back to the house, her house. I mean, she had there was several stories high, this apartment building in New
Yes,
York,
massive.
right?
Yes, massive. Um, that could be. I think Dorothy probably left the bar on her own 2 feet, and maybe once they were back at her townhouse, he administered more of the lethal dose of the alcohol or drugs. But it obviously would have looked suspicious if she'd been carried out of there. That would have alerted, um, patrons that were there. So I think she left with him, able to do that herself, and then, as time wore on, or maybe he slipped her something further, then that's when it took effect once she was back at her residence.
But do you think, I mean, do you know who did the autopsy? If an autopsy was actually conducted, or I mean, and do you think that they would have reported all of what they found inside of her? Could they just have talked about drugs? I mean,
Mhm.
barbiturates and alcohol just to cover it up because it seems like it's one of the cover-up stories that those crime stories that Dorothy was pursuing relentlessly, like the Sam Shepard case and of course JFK and many others.
Yes. Well, and as I say in my book, she, in a way, became kind of a starring role in her own murder mystery, if you will. And I mean, there's always the concern of corruption within the coroner's office, the district attorney's office, local law enforcement. And that's just something we can't avoid. But I've looked at her autopsy report, and there's no signs of a struggle, no signs of strangulation. It does not look like a physical confrontation. I know some people think maybe he killed her in sort of a lover spat or domestic violence situation. And I don't think it points to that. I think, it looked like someone was looking for something in that bedroom. The closet was kind of in disarray, but she was not in any kind of disheveled state. So that's why, to me, it feels premeditated. It doesn't feel like a lover's spat. It feels like he came prepared to silence her if necessary. And that's what happened. And I think being in the CIA as he was, he would know how to poison people, make it look like an accident. I think he would be very skilled in that. And I can certainly at some point talk a little bit more about his background to kind of lay this foundation better. But I think it is a drug and alcohol overdose. But even the law enforcement, they just cannot pull the trigger on the idea of it being an accident or suicide or homicide. They left that door open, and the door's never been closed. It's never really been resolved as to the circumstances.
Exactly. And it's also extremely unusual and suspicious that nobody talked about it afterwards. Everybody seemed like they'd been silenced or threatened not to talk about it. And even her colleagues and friends on the panel on What's My Line, they never really actually talked much about Dorothy or her death afterwards. And nobody came out and questioned what actually probably happened because it was extremely suspicious. And she was about to break that case open, the JFK case. And her interviewing Jack Ruby as well, and those hearings or the testimony there, and obviously she had written a lot, right? She almost had like a whole manuscript or a book script ready, and all of that was taken away, wasn't it?
That's certainly the theory. And through my research, going through newspaper archives, I have found dozens and dozens of columns that Dorothy wrote, from the time Kennedy was assassinated up to the weeks before her death, that lay out a lot of, I would say, very damning um, accusations, information about there being a conspiracy to assassinate the president. So she was very vocal in her columns about this too, that I think a lot of people are very easy to dismiss her as not knowing anything important, maybe. And it's just not the case. I mean, I've gone through the columns. They're heavily quoted throughout the book. And I can tell you, different anecdotes of her suspicions or information she obtained, particularly the Dallas Police Department radio files. And, she was writing about this stuff in real time. And so I think it's just very uninformed when people say she didn't have anything interesting to put in a potential book, because it just does not seem to be the case. And she was likely saving maybe the juicier tidbits for a book. I mean, I think a lot of people would like give it away in your newspaper column. So the exact content of that manuscript, unfortunately, is not known. But the summer before she died, she spent some time in Switzerland. And I think I'm really the only author, at least the first, to kind of at least speculate that perhaps she stashed the manuscript there, some papers. Obviously the Swiss are known for their banking and security deposit boxes, that, maybe somewhere there's some material, maybe not all of it, but I think it's unlikely she would just be carrying it under her arm everywhere she went without any copies or any other safety precautions. she could be mugged on the subway. I mean, why would you just carry it all under your arm? So I know some people have floated that idea, and it's likely materials were taken in her apartment, but I suspect there could be copies or duplicates somewhere. And I think just the timing with that Switzerland trip could point to maybe some things having been stashed there,
That
potentially.
still is not found, or do you think has also been taken and taken by the Secret Service? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think there would be different banking regulations in Switzerland that would maybe protect her um, or her heirs, whoever would have access to it. But I think it's an interesting possibility that there could be copies somewhere. I think it just seems very unlikely for as savvy and intelligent as Dorothy was to just keep it all, on her desk or in a file in a briefcase or just something that could be very easily swiped or taken. So it wouldn't surprise me if we someday some material would ever come to light. And that's definitely my theory anyway.
But they're trying to do everything in their power not to talk about or open the JFK assassination case again. Recently, in recent years, they tried to look into all of that again and determined once more that it was Lee Harvey Oswald, which is based more or less ridiculous. And it's of course, and I think most people in the world think that way. I mean, I don't know if there are actually many people left that believe the official story. So, I mean, all of it fits together also with the death of Marilyn Monroe. And she died, I believe, the day after Dorothy had done a piece on her in her column about her being in a relationship, having a romantic relationship with the one of the Kennedys. People thought it was JFK, but I think she alluded to the fact that it was Robert Kennedy, right?
Yes, and of course he was not named, but it was one of those blind items, it would be called in a column, where you could kind of just use your context clues to figure out who it was. And I do explore that in my book, of course, because I think Dorothy felt like, could I have been responsible? Did I get a ball rolling here? Someone killing her. And unfortunately, Dorothy, for as good of a journalist as she was, she did not have the most accurate information on Marilyn. Marilyn was really staging a comeback. She had renegotiated her contracts with the studio. She was not a dried up has-been. Marilyn's been portrayed very tragically, and I think Dorothy's columns did not help that. And as time wore on, Dorothy, I think, went from this idea of, oh, this poor tragic woman took her life. Her whole life was a suicide note, Dorothy even wrote. And then that changed. Dorothy became very skeptical of Eunice Murray, the housekeeper, wanted to know why things were being washed and, doing laundry before the police are even called. And she felt like there had been kind of a hush job put on this, that kind of compared it to a case that Perry Mason might investigate. So she seemed very skeptical that Marilyn had taken her own life, at least as time wore on, or maybe she cultivated some more information. But she really did not let that story go for quite a while. I mean, she was very fixated on Marilyn's death. And then just like anything, kind of moved on from that case. But I would say that was maybe the first suspicious death that Dorothy probed. Before JFK's assassination, she was interested in the circumstances surrounding Marilyn's death.
But wasn't it almost the same way that she supposedly died after everything that she revealed about Marilyn? Dying and alcohol and barbiturates and maybe taking her own life and being a sad suicide note and all of that. This is everything. And she was found in her bedroom, Marilyn. And so was Dorothy. It was almost like a dress rehearsal.
It's creepy when you look back on it, for sure. The similarities, the parallels. I mean, not identical cases, certainly, but yeah, little did Dorothy know that she would die in a similar means, and would also have an air of mystery to it as well.
But what if both of them were staged in the same way and done by the same people, done away by the same people?
I mean, I think you could definitely make the argument that the same forces, if you will. I mean, like I said, I tend to think Ron Pataki was involved in Dorothy's death. I don't see a reason for him to be involved in Marilyn's, but the same types of
Well, that was probably the Kennedys, right? Or I mean, at least Robert Kennedy Jr., Bobby.
that's a very solid theory. I mean, I think a lot of people share that belief that he would have the most motive.
And people involved with the mafia as well. And Dorothy was involved with the mafia in a way, or had ties to the mafia. She knew a lot of influential people. And when you look at it now, also being a friend of JFK, and she knew all of the presidents at that time, and she knew a lot of influencers and all of the celebrities as well. She covered Queen Elizabeth's coronation. Um, she was the top reporter of the time, and she had a lot of influence. Every time she wrote something or said something, people would hear it and they would listen. It's not like today where there's stuff coming from all sides and you just don't know what is what, and everything is confusing. At that time, people were reading the newspapers, they were listening to the radio, they were watching that show on television. Everybody knew the name of Dorothy Kilgallen, so she was highly influential. And when she went in there and was digging, she was relentless. She wanted the truth, and she wanted to, reveal these cover-up cases. And she did not. It seemed like she wanted to expose these conspiracies.
Well, and Dorothy was very much what I would call an old school journalist. Her father, Jim Kilgallen, was probably one of the most famous journalists of the 20th century. So before Dorothy even had her Voice of Broadway column, which you could classify as a gossip column, celebrity news, she was doing hard news reporting, court cases, crimes, really breaking that glass ceiling of the types of reporting that women were supposed to be doing in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. But she was with the Hearst Syndicate, and William Randolph Hearst Sr. admired her greatly. And when he died in the early 50s, Dorothy even wrote a bit of a eulogy in her column about just how much she credited him with letting women, allowing women to cover all sorts of different topics in his news syndicate, and how he kind of just watched from afar and really trusted her news sense. And the influence she had, is unmatched. Being with the Hearst Syndicate, 1 in 3 people read a Hearst newspaper, kind of at the height of Dorothy's syndication. Not to mention the 60 million people who watched her on What's My Line. So, I think a lot of people try to discredit her abilities as a journalist when we know that she was just a really solid investigative reporter. Obviously cultivated a lot of sources. I know you mentioned, organized crime figures, Frank Costello, she was very good friends with. But I think that, any good journalist does try to infiltrate levels of organized crime or government or different organizations where you could glean useful information.
But do you think in some kind of way, I mean, that there has been a lot of speculation from certain people that maybe Dorothy was on the payroll, maybe, or even working behind the scenes for the CIA or the FBI. Certainly she had ties to it, as we know, but even some people suggest that she could maybe have been a spy because she was, operating in all of these different circles with these influencers and traveling around the world. Could there be a truth to that, do you think?
I mean, I personally don't think that's true. I think she was very independent minded. I mean, she was not really known to, let's say, endorse a political candidate. Just that very old school, kind of middle of the road, neutral, independent thinker. And so I just don't think she would ever do that. When she got Jack Ruby's transcript he gave before the Warren Commission, she published it before LBJ had even read it. That launched a federal investigation. I mean, the FBI was pretty upset with her. And when they confronted her, she said she would rather die than give up her source. She protected her source. And that's why I think she would have had a separation from the government. I think she was kind of a watchdog reporter, if you will. So I don't think she would have been on any payroll. I mean, it's an interesting idea, but it's just not one that I support.
You don't support that
No,
idea. So, and
no.
that we of course don't know because she was so involved in all of that. But we do know from, I mean, about celebrities, and she was writing that gossip column, that sometimes they wanted the studios, the Hollywood studios wanted to promote a certain actor or actress and their film and their work in her column because she could really make it a success, make it or break it. But then
Yeah.
she would almost like blackmail these people and saying, "Oh, I will do all of that for you if you have one or good or two or three good, very good stories, gossip, obviously, about certain actors in the business." And they would provide her with with that information, right?
Yeah, and I think you have to, I remember being in college and my history professor saying the past is a foreign country. And it sounds crazy to today's viewers or listeners to think that that would ever fly, but that's kind of the business of gossip columns. I mean, we certainly had Walter Winchell and Luella Parsons, had a Hopper, although I think Dorothy was more of a journalist than they were, doing more hard news as well. But I think it would be very typical to say, yeah, I'd love to promote such and such star. What else do you have? What else could I use for my column? That column went out, I think, 5 days a week, every day for 30 years. So I'm sure she was always looking for information, always trying to cultivate sources. And it could be kind of cutthroat. But, as her biographer, I'm not really trying to, justify that or say that gossip's great. I love gossip columns. It's just to describe kind of the climate of the time of what people were interested in reading about. And it could be things that were unflattering about some of these celebrities, but I think it kind of came with the territory. I think most celebrities felt like as long as my name was spelled right, I got in her column and I'm just going to have to roll with whatever she said about me.
Maybe her reputation as a journalist was tarnished a bit by the fact that she was writing all of this gossip, because she was a very profound newspaper woman, right? A reporter at first, and was very interested in these crime cases. And that was at another level. And she also she had an interesting way of writing.
Mhm.
So, do you think, I mean, was it because she was herself fascinated by all of these celebrities and being able to throw all these amazing parties in her home with all of these famous names? A bit of a snob, really.
Well, and going through some of Dorothy's columns, I mean, there's name dropping, there's bragging on this or that. I mean, she certainly had a very privileged life. She was wealthy, Upper East Side, world traveler. And I'm sure there could be perceptions of that. She's a complex person. I mean, certainly I have plenty of stories of people saying how warm and thoughtful, considerate she was. But um, as a female journalist, I think she also had to have a bit of a thick skin and didn't back down from, feuds and conflict, and had to kind of face that head on.
Well, it was said, though, she was a bit of a drama queen. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I mean, I don't know. I guess when she got the opportunity to do the Voice of Broadway column, she'd actually began kind of more doing Hollywood West Coast reporting and then came back to New York. So I don't really think that was her first love. I think news reporting, what you'd maybe call hard news reporting, was her first love. But the column is what she was known for, and that paid the bills, and she had to probably make it the best she could. And that included making it kind of juicy and having a following of people reading it every day. I think it was probably a strategic career move.
A strategic career move, and more lucrative maybe, and put her on the map and gave her that success and fame by being involved in all of those with all of those famous people, more so than just covering crime cases, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Hearst paper, her flagship paper, was the Journal American. It folded the year after she died. I think they felt like she was good to send to these murder trials because she would make headlines, she would have a following. So I think there was some strategy to the types of stories she covered, and because of her expertise and versatility that could be a murder case one day, it could be the coronation, it could be a presidential inauguration the next, because she was certainly interested in all of these topics. I mean, she had kind of free reign. I mean, it certainly seemed like she was not particularly censored. So when you look at her column, they're kind of what I would describe as vignettes. There might be just a like kind of a blurb about this, a blurb about that, and they didn't necessarily connect. And you might have a piece about so-and-so is doing a nightclub act. The next piece is warning about political forces in Venezuela. The next thing is about something with Castro. She was very critical of Castro. The next item would be about Bob Hope. The next thing would be about a movie. Then the next thing would be something kind of geopolitical again. And almost like a stream of consciousness, because she felt like she could maybe use that space to kind of get out some political ideas, let people know what's going on in the world, communism, oppressive regimes, things we needed to keep on our radar, foreign policy issues, all kind of wedged in that Voice of Broadway column.
Hmm. But according to a 1979 interview with Hollywood actress Lauren Bacall on the Dick Cavett show, she says, Dorothy was a horrible woman. She told the world about Humphrey Bogart's illness and even said invented a hospital that didn't exist and a floor that obviously didn't exist that he was in, and because it was known to all of these reporters, they would not talk about it publicly, but she would just go for the truth and go for the throat, really, and publish this well, to the world. And it apparently she seemed very upset with Dorothy and did not forgive her for that, and said that she had not. She said she was just a horrible woman. What do you think of that? I mean, they must have known each other before Bogart became ill.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a good admirer of Lauren Bacall and love her movies, and I could honestly see how you wouldn't want sensitive information in the paper about a loved one's health condition, that they're dying, especially if things weren't accurate. Who knows where Dorothy got the hospital information? I'm sure she felt like it was through reputable means. I mean, bear in mind, Hearst had lawyers. I mean, it's not like she wanted a libel case. So I'm sure it had been a well-intentioned item in her column, but it makes perfect sense that Lauren would not be pleased by that. I certainly am sympathetic to that. But I definitely feel like as her biographer, Dorothy's biographer, it's not really for me to pass judgment per se. I think a reader can decide, where that line is of what's acceptable in a column, what's too private, too personal. I kind of would leave that to the readers to decide, if they thought Dorothy ever crossed the line in her columns.
Well, she certainly was very controversial and relentless in pursuing a story and digging deep into these dark corners
Yeah.
to get a story out. Maybe, and she was doing that more than being considerate to the people she was writing about. It was more important for her to get that truth out or whatever it was. I mean, in order to always be like a front runner in a way. And it's almost like a characteristic that you see often in a man who would go for a story. I mean, she was very much like that, but even more so in a different way. Maybe she stood out because she was a woman and maybe even reaching a certain level where that didn't have consequences anymore. Maybe was even easier for her being a woman until it wasn't easy anymore and she was silenced, obviously. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are parts of Dorothy's story as I was writing where you really had to see it through a feminist lens. She had very famous views, certainly with Frank Sinatra, Jack Parr, Johnny Carson a little bit. And she might criticize something about their career or opinion on something, and they'd immediately hit back with criticizing her appearance. We know Sinatra dubbed her the Chinless Wonder. That is maybe the most famous feud. And I think Dorothy was a woman of ideas, and a lot of these men came back with, oh, well, she's this or she's that. Johnny Carson likened her to a circus clown. And it just seems like even today we see that a lot with certain politicians. They're very eager to, clap back at their opponent by criticizing their appearance, kind of misogynistic comments. And Dorothy certainly encountered that her whole career. There were some male columnists who wrote it for a rival paper that even accused her of cheating on What's My Line, saying that she knew some of the guests ahead of time or could see through her blindfold. She was just kind of assailed at all different angles, and a lot of them had to write retractions because they couldn't prove their claims.
But I mean, she certainly did divide the waters in a way, and there were some people that were for her and supported her, and certainly people that really didn't. So she was in that way very controversial. There were like two camps with Dorothy, right? And we heard about that, of course, the famous feud you just mentioned with Frank Sinatra, and he was supposedly a very dangerous man.
Yeah, I mean, I know some people think he could have been involved in her death, and that's always a possibility. I'm not going to shoot that down, but I think something to kind of keep in mind too with your viewers is, feuds kind of sizzle too. They're kind of glamorous. I mean, I don't know if Sinatra hated Dorothy enough to actually kill her. I think he liked talking about her. I think there was maybe even that love to hate you kind of thing, phenomenon, right? Um, so I don't think he shed a tear when Dorothy died, but I just don't think, I think he had bigger fish to fry. I think he had other enemies and people he had other feuds with. It just doesn't really seem logical that of all of the people in the world, Sinatra would want to bump her off. But
But he was certainly involved with the mafia, a part of it, and he
yeah,
had ties to the let's say the secret hidden hand behind the government and all those things. We know that. And it was kind of also there was a huge feud between the mafia and the US government, and they were also kind of working together. And I think I think Dorothy exposed some of that, didn't she?
she did. And I think in terms of the Sinatra feud, it really stemmed from a multi-part series she wrote in the Hearst papers about him, that explored his childhood, early career, personal life, tumultuous relationship with Ava Gardner. It could be a little snarky at times. I do quote from that extensively. So I think she painted a not terribly flattering portrait of Sinatra. And I think he was maybe kind of egotistical enough to really take it super personally and just kind of had this vendetta against her. But it really stemmed from that newspaper
Maybe he
series.
didn't want to be exposed or outed for what he actually was involved with,
I'm sure.
which wasn't just singing My Way in New York, New York.
I'm sure there were those concerns. I mean, he certainly has a complex history. I know a lot of people have explored that in some depth, which I haven't per se. I'm not really a Sinatra biographer, but just kind of know a little bit because of their feud with Dorothy. I think it's possible. I definitely think it would have harmed his image a little bit to be associated with mobsters. I could see that.
Dorothy, as you said, she like broke the glass ceiling for women. She broke grounds and barriers at a time when women really did not have a very lucrative career. And of course, she became very successful and very elitist as well. And she was very ambitious and went for it at an early age. But do you think, even with that ambition and that level of intelligence and talent for doing what she was doing, that she would have landed that, let's say, or gone to that level had it not been for her father,
I, yeah.
what James Kilgallen, right, who was a very famous man. So wasn't it through, let's say, nepotism? Not that there's anything particularly wrong with that, but do you think it was just her as a woman being relentless at the time, or do you think because of these very good and very right connections?
Well, I mean, it's definitely no secret that her father helped her get her first newspaper job. She even dropped out of college to pursue a career in journalism. I think they had a good relationship. My father's a journalist too, so I can certainly see that, kind of looking up to them, advice, how would you handle this situation? When Dorothy covered the Queen's coronation, she actually was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for that coverage. And I found a very endearing article that Jim Kilgallen wrote about Dorothy that was in honor of that Pulitzer Prize nomination, where he talked a lot about how she came up through the ranks. And yes, he got her the job, but she was the one that she'd be sent to very rough neighborhoods. She'd have to go down to the morgue and identify bodies. She had a gun pulled on her at Sing Sing prison. She certainly, I think, proved that she could stand on her own 2 feet, even though her father obviously helped her get that foot in the door.
Oh, certainly, absolutely. She was born on July 3rd, 1913, and she died under those circumstances on November 8th, 1965. And she became already very known in the 1930s, or was it in the 1940s? I think she already started in the 30s. She married a not too successful actor, Richard Colmar. In 1940, they had three children: Richard Jr., Jill, and Carrie Colmar, and they became very successful together with their radio show. And Dorothy then became known as the voice of Broadway in that New York journal. What is it called?
The Journal American.
New York Journal American, yes. And then, of course, What's My Line? But I mean, she was working on a lot of things all the time. So talk about this marriage, because it is so interesting that they got married, and some people speculate that Richard Colmar was interested in marrying Dorothy to enhance his own career or become more famous because she was so famous. I don't know if there's any truth to that. They certainly had the three children, but he was supposedly cheating on her at some point, and that went on, and then they lived separate lives, but pretending to be together and live together in that huge house there. But he died suspiciously just 5 years later, was it, after Dorothy's death?
About that, yeah. And I honestly don't know a lot about his death, but I think it was maybe more of a likely suicide. It sounds like he kind of was just taking a lot of prescription drugs that were made available to him. I mean, I certainly know after Dorothy died, his drinking problem increased. Carrie, who was considerably younger than the older two, was still living at home, and he sent Carrie off to a boarding school. And they had a pretty strained relationship after Dorothy's death. So I don't know if that kind of pushed him over the brink with kind of substance use and depression. But
But do you think he was in the know, Sarah? Do you think that Dick Colmar was in the know about what had happened to Dorothy, and that he knew that she was murdered by maybe the CIA or whatever, behind the government, because she wanted to expose the JFK assassination, what really happened? Do you think that he knew more than, well, he ever said, and was threatened?
I think it's very likely because we know that Bob and Barbara Bach, who were close friends of the Colmars, Bob was a CBS producer, felt like Richard had said kind of some cryptic things about there are things I can't tell you, have to go with me to my grave. And they kind of read between the lines thinking it pertained to, the Kennedy assassination, Dorothy's notes. I think if anyone would know, obviously Richard would be a good candidate. I do think something I've tried to do in the book is to make Richard a little more three-dimensional. I think it's easy to kind of portray him as out of work, down and out. a drunk. When they got married, he was doing a Broadway show with Desi Arnaz. He was a very successful restaurateur, owned a restaurant right across the street from Madison Square Garden. That had to be some pretty prime real estate. I think Richard was quite a successful man on his own merits as an actor, producer, restaurateur, and had some personal demons that negatively impacted kind of the latter part of his life. And certainly when they ceased doing the radio show, um, about a year or so before Dorothy's death, that was a blow to him. But I think they had at least what you might call maybe a lavender marriage. I think he likely was bisexual. We know they both, had kind of their separate personal lives. But from everything I can find, I think they had a genuine affinity for each other and a friendship and a respect for each other. So I always laugh at people who think he could have killed her. I don't think that's possible. She was worth more alive than she was dead. I don't think he would have it in him. And there was no reason to. I think they had not the best marriage, but I think there's complexities, as we know, that life is full of a lot of gray area. And I think it's only fair to also highlight Richard's accomplishments, that he was not just Mr. Kilgallen. He had a very interesting career and life, separate from Dorothy's influence, I would say.
But don't you think it's just as ridiculous to suggest that Richard was behind the Dorothy's murder, or somebody in the household? I mean, nobody would gain from that. Isn't it so
Um,
obvious that this was a staged crime and done very professionally in a way? Also, the way where she was found, how she was sitting and wearing all of this makeup and the hairpiece and all of those things. I mean, it was like saying Lee Harvey Oswald did that thing, shooting the president from so far away and all of that. It seems almost like ridiculous. How can people even suggest or believe that? But you still allude to the fact that that could have been the case, or what do you really think yourself? I mean, how deep do you go into this in your new biography about Dorothy?
Well, I believe she was murdered. And when I talk about people in the household, just to clarify, all I was meaning was may have tampered with the crime scene, only to make it look nicer or neater or move her, so she wasn't found by the police, face down in a pool of vomit or something. I think that has potential, that she was moved, and just kind of put there just to look a little neater. But after the fact, I mean, I think someone had come into the home with her after she got back from the Regency and administered a lethal dose of sleeping pills and alcohol. And, it was a massive townhouse. I think it had 7 floors. And so when people say, well, how did someone kill her and no one heard anything? I think it's very likely. I mean, would you have heard something going on in an apartment complex if you were maybe on the 2nd floor and they were on the 7th? Or I think it would be very reasonable to think that her husband and son and his tutor, the maid and butler, they would not have necessarily heard anything significant. But the
Maybe
maid
there
and
was no noise. Maybe it was
yeah,
all very, very
yeah,
silent and done, and she was placed there.
well,
I mean,
sure.
that's also very possible. And
Yeah.
but why would somebody in the household move her or do something to make it look nicer? Why would anybody even do that without being an accomplice? You would immediately pick up the phone and call the police and the authorities and all that. I mean, it's that sounds very suspicious in itself if somebody would do that to make what look nicer, that somebody had died.
Well, and I think you can certainly cast some suspicion there because, what Mark Sinclair found her about 9 in the morning or so. Well, the New York police didn't officially get dispatched there until about 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon. And they claimed they had heard it for the first time, that she was dead. Other people say it was closer to noon. So what was going on there all morning?
But
I
Mark
just,
Sinclair also said that there was a police car outside when he left after
yeah,
9, that they were sitting there, 2 cops.
yeah. Who knows who they were? I don't know. I mean, could have been a coincidence, could have been under surveillance. It's just not known, but it certainly adds a level of suspicion to the story, what they were doing there. But yes, it was several hours that went by before officially the police were told that Dorothy was dead, and the coroner came over, and an investigation was launched. So it does make you wonder what happened the rest of the morning, early afternoon, why police weren't called. Um, and I don't know if we'll know that for sure. I think that's definitely a house of secrets.
Do you think that Dorothy was, as was said, that she was an alcoholic or had become an alcoholic and a drug user using these barbiturates or pills, sleeping pills or whatever, during at some point? Because there was actually one, and or maybe even a couple, but certainly one infamous episode of What's My Line, where she appears and she is slurring her words. She can't really speak properly or pronounce the words, and she's excusing it, saying it was a sneeze, which obviously it wasn't. But I mean, that looked a little bit strange. Do you think she was under the influence, or did she not have a problem with it, but used it occasionally? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I feel like a lot of people are very quick to label her a drug addict or an alcoholic. It certainly makes it easy to dismiss her as a reporter. And at the time of her death, law enforcement had determined she was averaging about 2 sleeping pills a night over the last few years. And that's certainly not someone who's abusing them. And I think it's very unlikely she would be drinking, at least heavily, before she would go live on television. I mean, you have to remember, she was the only original panelist on What's My Line. The other guys didn't last in that first episode in February of 1950. She was able to stay on that show for entering its 16th season at the time. And so I just don't think she would show up inebriated, writing her column. I mean, this is someone that had to be pretty high functioning to cover cases. And as a journalist myself, you have deadlines, you have complex information, you have to condense and make it understandable. And you would have to do that sober. So I definitely disagree with people who think that she had some kind of serious problem. That's not to
But
say she
would
wasn't
she
a typical
really
drinker.
go on that show being intoxicated? Would she really go on that show being intoxicated? And
No,
I mean, it was a strange. You've certainly seen that episode,
I
and I
believe
think a lot
so.
of
Yeah.
people have. I've seen it a couple of times in order to see what is actually going on. It seems almost like, do you remember that movie called The Manchurian Candidate
Mhm.
that came out around that time? It almost seemed like she was under some kind of mind control or something. It was like something wasn't totally right. It seemed like it could have been intoxication,
Mhm.
but it's just an interesting observation to see what, not saying she was into that or she had a problem with it, but it's still going on television, uh, and everybody in the country watched it at that time, huh?
Yes, it was a very well received show. I definitely explore the fact that she had a pretty severe chronic anemia throughout her life. And I think potentially maybe even had TMJ, which can affect the jaw. So I think there's some maybe other um, theories as to why she might appear slurred or kind of a cotton mouth or appear, less than healthy, less than maybe the norm, just based on some pre-existing health conditions that she had that I've since explored that could maybe explain some of those abnormalities that you're speaking of.
And you say that she was the original panelist on What's My Line. But Arlene Francis, that wonderful actress and host as well, was really great and funny.
Ah,
She um she was there for that entire time as well. Maybe she came in
absolutely.
a couple of episodes later or what, but she
Yes.
went throughout the entire run until 67 and then went into and she also did the syndicated show that lasted until 75.
Yes, yes, I love Arlene Francis for sure. But yes, just to make that differentiation of there were three other men. One was the governor of New Jersey. There was a psychiatrist. There were three men on the panel that first show, and they were just so ill at ease. I mean, you could tell they were just not comfortable. And Dorothy, I think, being a reporter, being an interviewer, having a radio show, was a little more polished. So it was her and John Daly really that were there from day one. And of course, Arlene and Bennett soon after.
Yes.
Hmm.
And also, it's notable that she was such a sharp mind, that was very intelligent, and she guessed, I guess, most of the occupations of the contestants on What's My Line. I mean, it's incredible how she can guess so many of all of those people, also the celebrities when they were blindfolded. I mean,
Yeah,
it was quite extraordinary, wasn't it? I mean, she was quick.
she was. And I think you could attribute a lot of that to being a journalist. You know, we have to be very observant. Sometimes you listen more than you talk. And I think some of that guessing or powers of deduction would come naturally to a journalist, where maybe it wouldn't if you were merely a singer or a comedian or any of the other book publisher, whatever. I think she certainly had her journalism career as an advantage on What's My Line, and was certainly times she was very criticized, again by men, I tend to find, who seem very jealous of her abilities to um, guess the contestants right. I mean, she was always very criticized for being maybe too aggressive, too competitive. Goodson Todman, who produced the show, would get lots of hate mail about getting Dorothy off the show. She didn't have that warmth and charisma that Arlene Francis had. Why do you have Dorothy on the show? Get rid of her. And it would be interesting to see if any men on there were criticized for being too aggressive or too competitive. But there we are with Dorothy. They're not traits that women should have, apparently, at least in that mid-century. They weren't.
Miss Messick, are the people who come to you ever in a romantic frame of mind?
Yes?
Do they ever come two by two, heterosexually?
Hey. Oh, say, Dorothy, please. After all, this is a family program.
Well, and I have a family.
Yeah, they sometimes come two by two heterosexually, yeah.
Right.
But actually, they more often take the bus.
Well, do you have anything to do with the holy estate of matrimony?
Yes?
Do you have anything to do with the issuing of licenses?
No?
That's 3 down and 7
Well, nobody criticized Arlene Francis, certainly, and she also had a sharp mind and also guessed a lot. I mean, she was amazing in that way, but she was more charming and witty and, very likable. And Dorothy was, in fact, there is this, you probably heard it, you must have, this very interesting interview, a recorded interview with Bennett Cerf, the Random House chief publisher and panelist on What's My Line from 1968, where he describes Dorothy Kilgallen as the villain of the show, and that she was less liked than anybody else on the panel during their 15-year run. He also said that she was quick and sharp-minded and fiercely into winning the game. So she was
Mhm.
very competitive. And it was probably that trait, that personality that she had, always going for the throat, basically, that also was shining through there. Even though they probably felt like family, he still said these things. What are your thoughts about what Bennett said in that 68 interview?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have the impression that Bennett and Arlene, John Daly to some extent, were kind of work colleagues and weren't necessarily with a deep friendship. I briefly interviewed Peter Gable for my book, the son of Arlene and Martin Gable. And now he thinks Dorothy met with foul play, and he was certainly interested in the Kennedy assassination. So he provides some interesting thoughts there. But he also felt like his mother and Dorothy did not really socialize outside of the show. I think they were friendly. I mean, I describe in my book as them being friendly, but not necessarily friends. And so I could see how Bennett would maybe admire Dorothy in some ways as, very smart and very sharp, a good journalist. But maybe there were traits on the show that he did not find to be as endearing. I mean, I've certainly heard Bennett say very positive things and then these things too that are less flattering. I think like anything, they probably had some complex relationships, that developed over the course of the show where maybe some nights they were all clicking, other nights they were maybe grating on each other a little bit. So I'm not surprised by Bennett's comments, but I think overall they liked her, but maybe didn't necessarily socialize a lot outside of the show.
But he did, well, Bennett Cerf, he did publish one of her books in the 50s, right? So, I mean,
So
some of the crime cases.
yeah, so that book is called Murder One, and that actually came out posthumously, I think in '66, after Dorothy died. And a ghostwriter actually got involved to finish it up, kind of writing in Dorothy's voice. And so it chronicles some of her big court cases. Obviously, the Sam Shepard case was the big one because Dorothy had helped him get a new trial. And today we know he was likely innocent. So that's what that book pertains to. The other book she was working on would have been just exclusively on the Kennedy assassination. And of course, that never came to fruition.
No, so it was so he published it afterwards, and then people, it was like a collection of different crime cases that she had been very involved in and wrote about, huh?
Yeah, and there are cases that maybe today people wouldn't have a lot of following of, but they were maybe the big case in, the mid 40s or what have you. Some of them even escape my mind at the moment. With really Sam Shepard being maybe the most well-known case today, but they were just her thoughts on, the defendants, the prosecution, kind of fly on the wall types of things. It's a very good read. I definitely recommend it.
Hmm. And the Sam Shepard case became kind of known today because of the movie The Fugitive with Harrison Ford, and I think there was a television series also, The
Yes,
Fugitive in the
that's right.
70s at some point or something, or was it the
Yeah.
60s? That I don't know.
Yes, and what I was going to show you here is Dorothy was such a big celebrity that even when Dr. Shepard was convicted that first time, her paper ran an article saying Dorothy Kilgallen shocked, believes reversal likely. Like they thought that was the most important part of the case, how shocked Dorothy was, because she felt like the state had not proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt, and it was a largely circumstantial case. And I cite this as significant because I think it shows Dorothy's abilities, critical thinking skills, her ability as a journalist to, kind of fact find, and how she really had that foresight back in the 50s that this case isn't over. There's more to come out. And because the judge, Judge Blythen, had said some things to Dorothy that were very biased against Sam Shepard, that was how she got the ball rolling on their prejudicial treatment. Let's get this guy a new trial. And so that's kind of how the ball got rolling, that she had flagged this as an unfair trial just based on what she had even conversed with the judge about. And I think it was certainly fortunate that even though that was a bit of a technicality, we saw when Dr. Shepard got that new trial that, DNA had advanced and they concluded that his wife had been killed by someone who I think was left-handed and he was right-handed, or vice versa. And sadly, he did not live that long on the outside. He died kind of young. But I think in a lot of ways he's been kind of vindicated. And you could credit Dorothy as at least helping to get that ball rolling.
Yes, definitely. But Dorothy has not been vindicated, that's for sure. But in recent years, I guess it's come to the attention of a lot of people that this case is a very, very big case. It's been kept under the rock, and she's kind of been forgotten on purpose. Nobody has talked about it. Of course, there was this famous, well, I don't even know how famous that was, but it's an old book by an author, Lee Israel,
Yeah.
in 1978, I think. But then in recent years, Mark Shaw, a lawyer from San Francisco. He has been talking about, he's lecturing on the mysterious death of Dorothy Kilgallen. He has written several books, The Reporter That Knew Too Much and all of that. So Mark Shaw, he's really going for it and has a lot of information. So your book here, what's the difference between the investigation and research that Mark Shaw is presenting relentlessly also, and your work here in your biography?
Mhm. I'm glad you brought that up because, like I said, my magazine article had come out in 2007, and Mark Shaw wrote to me in about 2014 saying he was planning a book on Dorothy and wondered if myself and my father would be interested in, being interviewed, helping provide some leads for sources, information. And we did so, connected him with people we thought could be helpful, contact sources. And it was kind of at the time he was writing the third book, I want to say kind of 2019, that my father and I thought maybe we would write a book. And he's actually in the process of writing a book on Marilyn Monroe. It's called The Real Marilyn Monroe. He's got to come on your show. It's so fascinating. It's about 800 pages right now. But I bring it up because initially we thought we would write one big book that would kind of explore Dorothy's life and Marilyn's life, kind of juxtapose their stories. That was a terrible idea because our books went in such different directions. But at the time, when Mark reached out, I think to my father, saying, I'm doing a book on Dorothy and also exploring Marilyn this time, we said, well, so are we. What a coincidence. Let us know how that goes. And we never heard from him again. So I don't know if we went from maybe being potential sources to competition. And so the third book came out, the fourth book came out, and just going through them, I felt like I wanted to do my own book, that it was time. Enough time had passed since me doing that article. I went to college, got a job at a newspaper. The timing was better. And I felt like I had some information that Shaw didn't have. And a lot of that comes from newly declassified government documents that I've gone through. My book is really the up-to-the-minute latest information on the Kennedy assassination. And then, of course, all the information on Ron Pataki is unique to us and our publication. Because, like I said, my father cultivated I would say, I don't know if I'd say friendship, but a rapport with Ron over the course of about a decade.
Really,
And
a decade?
yes. And I
Yeah.
think that's important to note just because when Lee Israel wrote her book, and it's a wonderful book, she really opened the door. She referred to Ron as the out-of-towner, maybe for liable reasons, or publisher didn't want him named, but that's who it is. And my article in 2007 named him for the first time. And we reached out to Ron. And believe it or not, he was very receptive to being interviewed. Was very pleasant, very cordial. And, we all but accused him of being a murderer. So we found that a little strange. And so my father would run tape on him. And it got to the point where sometimes Ron would even just call just to shoot the breeze. My father has been a journalist for 50 years or so, and they'd sometimes just talk shop. They talk about the newspaper business. They talk about things not related to Dorothy. And so I feel like because of that connection, my father was able to get information from Ron that, was maybe a little more sensitive, was maybe a little more of your guard let down. Because I know Pataki was not fond of Lee Israel. He referred to her as, I believe, that pain in the ass lesbian who was in love with Dorothy. So I can imagine their interviews didn't go very well. And just from what I've read in Mark's books, I don't think Pataki had a lot to say. Obviously you're kind of on the defensive if people are accusing you of wrongdoing. And it seemed, in my opinion, maybe kind of antagonistic between Pataki and Shaw, where we never really, went there. And I think maybe Ron trusted my father a little bit more, him being a journalist. And that's when, honestly, things came out in recorded interviews that kind of, as we've listened to them, looked back on them, feel like Ron has implicated himself in being involved in the 1954 coup in Guatemala. And he said he was there, although he called it a small military operation, although the US didn't have troops there officially. It was a paramilitary operation funded by the CIA. So just kind of reading between the lines there a little bit. He was a student at Stanford University at that time in 1954, and was kicked out, kind of some minor shenanigans. But I have his school transcripts, and they show he had a great interest in foreign relations and kind of international intrigue, and was fluent in Spanish. So it just seems very likely that when he got into some trouble at Stanford, he got recruited to go to Guatemala, maybe didn't totally understand the implications of that, but said he was there, said he trained at the school in Panama for assassins. He had originally denied that. Then he said he actually was there. And so I feel like this is relevant because kind of once you're in the CIA or government payroll, I think it's very easy to stay on it, because one thing I think is important to point out is Ron Pataki, kind of out of school, got a job with the Columbus Citizen Journal. And Columbus, Ohio is not a super big city. I mean, it's not Los Angeles, it's not New York City. It's bigger than Des Moines, but it's kind of medium sized. So there he was covering movies and plays and doing entertainment news. And yet he traveled the world, and he dated Mia Farrow, and he was friends with Betty White and Robert Redford, and just kind of live on the West Coast sometimes, fly to New York to go see a show. And it really makes you wonder, with what budget? I know newspapers have shrunk, in today's market, but I don't think there was a budget for that. I think maybe the CIA was supplementing that income that allowed him to travel under the auspices of being just a reporter, just an entertainment writer. And then that's how he befriended mobsters and befriended the Kennedys and befriended movie stars. And I think it would have been perfect for him to befriend Dorothy. We know she liked younger men. Johnny Ray was much younger. He was a reporter. They could talk shop. They'd have that in common. I think he was kind of groomed to be someone that kept her under surveillance based on what we know of his past.
But was he also a charmer? Some people say, oh, he was quite good looking and, she really fell for him. He was younger and all of that. Do you think he was almost like trained, or it was like an assignment for him to pretend to be involved with Dorothy and pretend to be interested in her, emotionally or sexually?
Yes, I think assignment is a good word that you could use, because when Ron would talk about Dorothy, he always said it was platonic. It was a friendship. Maybe it was a little flirtatious, but not on his end. And those who knew Dorothy the best, her relatives, hairdresser, coworkers, they knew otherwise. And so the fact that Pataki denied a sexual relationship, to me, is trying to backpedal. Like, I only knew her so well. I couldn't be involved. He had to probably deny that a little bit, or he would really look suspicious. But I think he seemed like the type of person she would fall for. It's hard to believe, as smart as she was, that she didn't see through him. But perhaps she did that final night, and thought he was kind of leaking information. He was a part of the threats she was receiving.
Maybe that was what she was discovering, and she outed him or confronted him, and that led to her death that night.
I think that is a theory a lot of us have, especially based on Mark Sinclair saying that, he did her hair that final night of the show, just in her home. And she was a bit morose, kind of talking about, things just aren't great right now, and I don't know why. I'm a little uneasy. And, Mark Sinclair said, the only newish person in your life is Ron Pataki. Maybe you should ask him. And, he did her hair. She had a dress on. Then when he went to watch the show that night, it's live, bear in mind, she was wearing a different dress and looked a little more like going out, kind of more evening dress, like she was going to meet someone after the show. And so that's where we kind of make that connection to that would have been Pataki. Maybe after Mark left the townhouse, she called Ron and said, I really need to talk to you. Do you think you could meet me after the show? Can you get a late flight? We need to talk.
But didn't
And
she receive a call? And didn't she receive a call backstage at What's My Line that day, or was that another day? I
that was
heard something
another,
about her receiving a call,
yes,
and then she looked a little bit and she had to go.
that was another incident. Yeah, that was about a year prior. Over the loudspeaker, a voice had announced Ron Pataki's hotel keys are at the front desk. And that was unsettling to her because why would there be? I don't believe Dorothy's was named, but just his name being heard over the loudspeaker was unsettling. And so that was the first and only time that Dorothy had kind of that faux pas. Then when the show started, she was announced, came out on the panel and sat down and then quickly stood back up. Because of course they all stood until they were all announced and on the panel, and then they would sit and begin the show. So she was certainly a little flustered from that. I think someone was purposely trying to make her uncomfortable. Maybe even Pataki did it. I don't know. Could have been him. But that is that incident when she sits down and then quickly stands back up of, oh, we don't sit yet. It was that night.
But he was trying to pump her for, well, information, and he probably got that as well. And she was, according to Mark Sinclair, right? Or the other hairdresser, Charles Simpson, right?
When Mark called me that day and told me, and then we got back together again and he talked to me and told me where he found her and how he found her, it was abnormal. The whole thing was abnormal. It was just abnormal. The woman didn't sleep in that bed, much less the room. And if she still were sharing that room with Richard, that was Richard's bed. That's the one he set fire to. It wasn't her bed. Actually, even though I didn't know anything about the assassination, these people, whoever they were, didn't know that. They didn't know what Dorothy may have told us. And, yes, I kept it to myself and denied everything until recent years.
Do you think it's safe to talk about it now?
No.
No?
No.
She did leak something about it or talk about it. She couldn't really keep her mouth shut. Wasn't that actually the case?
Well, Ron had said that he even helped her write some articles, which I find a little hard to believe, but I think she was at least maybe consulting with him. I think he was very privy to the Warren Commission leak, her thoughts on the commission being ridiculous, and he was kind of involved, maybe from a journalistic standpoint, in her progression towards the truth. Now, in terms of being talkative, I mean, she wrote a series of articles, and I think my book is really, at least in my view, the only one out there that really delves into those columns in a lot of detail. There weren't just a couple of, justice is a big rug, you pull it out. I heard that quote 1,000 times. There's so much else that she was writing about. Dorothy likened what happened that day in Dallas to the movie 7 Days in May, which was about a political coup. So not the mob, a political coup. And she was very skeptical of the Johnson administration, felt like this had been, a hush-hush job. Who was Oswald anyway? She wrote. I mean, she was very talkative. She interviewed Aquila Clemens, who witnessed Officer Tippett's shooting, said it didn't look like Oswald was behind it. It was another man, didn't fit his description. She was very antagonistic of the official findings of the commission. And just numerous articles, actual articles, not column, not Voice of Broadway, byline news stories that were running across the country. So this was going on. I would say if I had to give you a turning point, when Kennedy was assassinated, the first few days, the columns were very sentimental, like when she and Carrie met the president and how wonderful Jackie is and how regal and classy she is. And then when Jack Ruby assassinated Lee Harvey Oswald on live television, meaning there would not be a trial. The tone of those columns and articles changed dramatically. They went from a nation in mourning to what's going on in Dallas? What's the security detail like? Charles de Gaulle can't go anywhere without all the security detail. What are we doing with open motorcades? And what's going on there? She added the Dallas police chief, Jesse Curry. He told the press that, well, yeah, we always knew it came from behind, the TSBD building. Yeah, we knew that from the beginning. Well, Dorothy obtained Dallas police radio records, of communication among officers, in their vehicles. And Chief Curry was actually riding in the pilot car ahead of the motorcade. So had a very good view of that triple overpass, the grassy knoll, the front, And what his radio communication says is, get a man on that overpass. I want to know what's going on over there. Then he tells the press, oh no, we always knew it was the TSBD building behind. We always knew it. And Dorothy was saying, well, no, you didn't. And you didn't have that building secured for at least 20 minutes. I mean, she was really poking so many holes in this story that I think people don't realize just how many columns she wrote and all of the suspicions she cast on the government as being behind this potentially, the Johnson administration, CIA, Secret Service. I think that's likely. I've kind of delved into that. I don't know how much you want to go into it, but I'm certainly more of the CIA, Lyndon Johnson behind the assassination, where I know other authors have been more organized crime solely feeling that way. I began this kind of thinking it was mob too, Carlos Marcello. I was just referring to a few notes here, if you'll bear with me. But one thing that I want people to know is Life magazine was planning quite a big story on Lyndon Johnson's corruption, and it was going to be a week after the assassination. They've been working on it all summer. Even Robert Kennedy's Justice Department was supplying information. And if Kennedy had not died when he did, Lyndon would have to have been forced to resign and prosecuted. The Billy Sol Estes stuff, the Bobby Baker scandals, that was all going to be exposed by Life magazine. And then JFK was killed, and they killed the story too. And then I also think another thing people have to bear in mind, and there was a very interesting documentary recently on what the doctors knew. The Parkland Hospital doctors felt very convinced. At least one shot came from the front. So that's interesting. And I don't know if a lot of people realize that the hospital there wanted to do the autopsy in Dallas, but that was the state law. You die in Dallas County, we do the autopsy in Dallas County. And I'm not always good with names, but the coroner who was at the hospital said, the body's going to stay here, I'm going to do the autopsy. And he was physically lifted up by a Secret Service agent and set down and told, no, you're not, we're taking the body. And the thing about Parkland Hospital is those doctors were some of the best trauma, gunshot wound, stabbing wound experts in the country. They saw a lot of crime. And instead, the Secret Service, and I kind of speculate as to why and how all that happened. Instead, the president's body is taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital, and his autopsy performed by people who weren't skilled in gunshot wounds. And it's just quite suspicious, I think, because who would have the influence to say, we're taking the body, we're going to a naval hospital, meaning we'd be under court-martial. We'd be under court-martial if we didn't follow directions. Would this be Carlos Marcello would have this kind of influence, or would it be the president of the United States? So that's why I think there's a lot of evidence where you could say, well, the Johnson administration, the Secret Service directly, even today, they directly answer to the vice president. So, the motorcade route was changed at the last minute. There's so many little details of this, the devil's in the details, as they say, but it couldn't have been organized crime, at least on its own. Maybe one of the shooters was mob, that could be, but I think this was very likely orchestrated by Lyndon Johnson, by the CIA, rogue elements. You have to bear some of that in mind. um, about, Kennedy had planned to get rid of the oil depletion allowance, which was a tax loophole. And of course, LBJ had some very wealthy, oil friends, H.L. Hunt. And it seems likely that this was kind of a government coup.
JFK made that very famous speech about uh, the secret societies and all the secrecy, and that should be exposed, and that is actually going on. A lot of stuff is going on behind closed doors, and there was this speech that everybody can even find on YouTube, and it was very shortly after that he was taken out.
I mean, it seems likely that Lyndon would be able to better serve these interests of the kind of these moneyed individuals. Um, and of course, look at the Warren Commission. I mean, look who was on it. They were government people investigating the government, really. Um, Al, Allen Dulles, had been fired by JFK as head of the CIA, largely due to the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And there he is on the Warren Commission. What did any of them know about anything? I mean, I think that is a fair criticism of they weren't forensic experts, they weren't doctors, they weren't pathologists, they weren't ballistic experts, the single bullet theory, they were just really stretching. And I feel like if it was just the mob behind it, Marcello or Trafficante or Giancana, if it was just a mobster who killed Kennedy, just bring them in. Bring them in and arrest them. Why all the
Of
secrecy?
course not. Do people really believe it could only be maybe mobsters behind all of this? I mean, it's so obviously a government cover-up. So it was organized crime, but just by their own people, really, wasn't it?
Government organized crime. Well, I mean, I think there are some authors that we've named today that are a little bit more of the mob was behind it. I don't think they're as critical of the CIA, from what I've read.
Really?
So,
Oh,
mhm.
that's very interesting, because I think it's absolutely obvious that depending on what angle you're researching this. I mean,
Mhm.
I think it'd be fair to say that it's quite obvious that JFK, Marilyn Monroe, and Dorothy Kilgallen was taken out by the same people within the government circles. What
Yeah,
is very
likely.
popular today to call the Illuminati circles, huh? What do you think of that?
I mean, I think there are some very clear similarities and some of the same actors that pop up. One anecdote I have that I think is compelling. Frank Sturgis, as we know, was a big CIA guy. He was one of the Watergate burglars. He said Dorothy got whacked. Now he told this to, a woman that, just talking to, people that are involved in other covert operations. Is she credible? I don't know. Is he credible? I don't know. Is it likely he would know? I think so. E. Howard Hunt and people like that have taken some culpability. I mean, we certainly have heard of people kind of saying, yes, I was involved, I was a planner, I was a shooter. And some of that has kind of gotten muddy today, but I think Frank Sturgis saying Dorothy was whacked, I mean, he's CIA. Maybe there's some truth to that. I think that you have to
But we
consider
do
that.
know from Mark Shaw that he wants justice for Dorothy Kilgallen, and he wanted to reopen the case, and he actually managed to talk to the police department, and they were ready to open the case, and they were opening the case, looking into it, and suddenly everything was silenced again, he said, and that he was just dismissed after a while, saying we didn't find anything, there's no evidence, it's an
Mhm.
old case, and it's not like that. So that took a totally different turn, and was so obvious that they didn't want any attention on this case about Dorothy.
Yes, I think what you're referencing was maybe around 2017 or something with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. And of course, at that time, Cyrus Vance Jr. was the district attorney, and he certainly has faced a fair share of scandals related to the Trump family and other kind of corruption allegations. So who knows? I think, though, the other thing you have to bear in mind is this is a very old, cold case, and maybe some of these law enforcement agents just simply feel like they don't have the resources to explore it right now. There are ongoing terrorism threats, homicides, crime in the city? Do we put our resources in that maybe? I don't know if everyone's necessarily on the take or if it's just not a priority case right now.
But do you think that's really the truth about it? Do you think that's the reason?
Well, I mean, I know Mark has, also, I think, petitioned for Dorothy to be exhumed. I was made privy to that. But I think you also have to think about how you're approaching this. Some of the things I have read that Mark has written, I don't know if I would have taken that approach or just kind of the sourcing. I don't know. To me, they seem maybe a little more making the story about him and his work and his efforts. And of course, they kind of fell on deaf ears. As far as I know, Dorothy hasn't been exhumed. And I don't know if there's much movement with the New York City police. I
So
think,
what would you like to see happen here? I
Mhm.
mean, by writing this book and actually also emphasizing and underlining the importance of looking into this so-called cold case.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, as I kind of, say in my book, Ron Pataki died in May of 2022. So, um, you can't bring up charges. And it's honestly kind of a circumstantial case in some way. Um, I don't know if there would ever be a day in court. I don't know who you would try. I don't know. I just don't see that maybe happening with, evidence hasn't been preserved the way that it should. People weren't, who are long dead now, they weren't interviewed. Um, where do you go with this? But I think, you maybe could get her death certificate changed. It could go from undetermined to homicide. I think that would be a step in the right direction. But I just don't know what we do now with
But
the
these
person's
days,
interest.
they have technology to examine DNA in a different way, old DNA
Mhm.
that they can where they can really determine what went on with the body or what happened.
Yeah.
I mean, so that was one thing that supposedly Mark Shore was trying to do, and I don't know. I mean, that could be one way to do it, but they probably don't want to do that, huh?
I think it's unlikely. I mean, obviously having her exhumed would potentially be useful. I mean, there's forensic anthropologists that they study old remains. There is that field of speciality, but who would pay for that? Would the law enforcement feel like this is a case that the taxpayer should be paying for? I don't know. I mean, I think there's kind of procedures in place and
They
just
would
writing
if they
a
would
letter.
find it interesting, huh? If they would think there's any significance and importance to it. But if that would reveal a lot of things that could open another huge can of worms about the JFK assassination, then probably they certainly would not want to do that. And also,
Yeah.
interestingly enough, none of Dorothy's children has ever gone public and talked about it. Have you spoken to any of the children or Carrie Colmar?
I have reached out and did not hear back. I'd wanted, to get comments because I feel like Carrie, especially being the youngest, he did work a little bit with Lee Israel in the 70s and participated in her book. The oldest two children have kind of fallen off the grid a little bit, I would say. Um, but I don't know. I don't know if Carrie just is tired of people talking about this, writing books. Certainly, there's been all these books on Dorothy. I don't know if he felt like I would be kind of one of the same. Didn't want to talk to me. I don't know if he's been contacted by other authors and just didn't want to get
Yeah, but
involved.
has he ever spoken to anybody really, except maybe Lee Israel? But that was in 78. It's 50, 45, whatever years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know of anything that he has said or written about his mother's death in terms of it being suspicious. I mean, I do know that he kept a blog for a while talking about, how much his relationship with his father disintegrated after his mother's death. And other stories too. Some were kind of charming and humorous, but I haven't found anything that had said specifically, we think she was murdered. We were afraid to say anything. I tend to think that's the case. I tend to think you would want justice for your mother, but maybe you think it's too steep of a price to pay.
Or
or
maybe he
worse on
was
your own.
threatened
They,
and told not to ever talk about it, or else. I mean, that is the first thing that comes to mind. Otherwise, you would really go for it, right? His mother
possible.
would.
Yeah, yeah. I have been a little surprised, that her family, children didn't seem to be particularly, at least publicly vocal. And I don't know if that will ever change. I don't know if there's a reason for kind of the hush feelings. But I could definitely see them being afraid of the repercussions or fearful of different powers. But I would think, though, if you think JFK was, died through a conspiracy and Dorothy was, you'd have to think, okay, well, that's why Dorothy died. It wasn't some other unrelated situation, to connect those dots. And would law enforcement today want to pursue this case that Dorothy was killed because of her investigation of the Kennedy assassination? Because at least here in our, kids' textbooks, Lee Harvey Oswald killed JFK. No conspiracy, lone gunman, single bullet theory. That is the official story. So anytime you challenge that, you kind of get that label a little bit of being, a conspiracy theorist or kind of dismissed as
But it's
being
very interesting that that term, conspiracy theorist, came out and was invented by the CIA in 1963, right, or 1964, after the JFK assassination. That was like a new term that came out there and was heavily publicized and promoted in a way in order to laugh at people who were asking critical questions,
Mhm.
like Dorothy publicly, but also just people in general thinking there's something that just does not make sense here. And the same goes probably with 9/11 and other cases and other things happening, you know. Can we always just depend on what they're saying in the media and whatever is the truth, like the NIST report or the Warren Commission and all those things? I mean, these are government officials. That's the same people that organize this whole thing, huh?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're kind of the people with the power. They have the commission and they all had their, resumes of being, governors, senators, top ranking officials. So, of course, whatever they conclude must be the truth. I think that was pushed out heavily, kind of that, I'd say it was kind of fall of 64 when the Warren Commission report was released. And Dorothy very much called them out on, well, you kind of just interviewed people who agreed with you. You didn't include all the other information. And she even talked about disappearing witnesses. And, we kind of know that today of sort of those convenient deaths associated with the
Yeah, there were
assassination. People
a lot of those, huh? But also, interestingly enough, Ron Pataki wrote some very, very strange poems.
hmm
And I think you maybe should talk about those poems because they are very clearly telling the world that he had something to do with Dorothy's death.
Yeah, and if I can find the graphic, I'll even show you. But yes, and I did know maybe some of those poems were even kind of what you might say is sort of a subliminal confession, or who writes those kind of things, right? He of course dismissed them as, I've written 1,000 poems. Who cares about this one?
Can I just ask you, now that your father and you knew Ron Pataki,
Mhm.
and you also actually told him, we do suspect that you participated in this and all that. Did he seem slick or manipulative or being on the surface? And you said he was very cordial and all that. Was he
Yeah.
pretending?
Yes. I don't know if that bespeaks of kind of psychopathy, but yes, but he read the article. So of course the article wasn't a secret, and it's very suspicious of his relationship and etc. Well, he immediately called them our, new, what do you want to call it, just our number, with the magazine, and was very complimentary of it, thought it was great, hope my journalism career just really took off, and at one point even said that, he had no children and maybe I'd like some of his, movie memorabilia someday.
He said
And
that, being so like really nice and accommodating to you, wanting to be like your friend.
well, and that's why I think we began running tape. I didn't have an immediate plan for a book, after that article came out. But I think, just us being journalists, we felt like you may as well keep this going. You never know what could come of it. So yes, of course, we thought it was strange that we all but said you did it. And he's calling to shoot the breeze. How's it going? What's your favorite kind of such and such? And it just seemed kind of odd. I don't know if he wanted just to kind of stay close to see what we were doing. I don't know. I don't know, but
So he was manipulative in a way. He was like
I think so.
charming and would you say he may be a psychopath?
I mean, I use that word psychopath just because, I think most people would kind of take offense at a little bit of this or say, I'm not going to talk to you. This is not, no, thank you. Hang up the phone, not answer your letter, whatever. But he always seemed very interested in talking about Dorothy. And we know that, based on criminal profiling, some people like to kind of keep revisiting their wrongdoings. They like to talk about it. They like to know what the police are working on. They like the thrill of it, maybe. That's just my opinion. I don't know. Maybe he wasn't involved in her death. I think it's likely he was, but unfortunately, we will never totally know. There's no way to, conclusively prove it at this point. So much time has passed and he's dead now.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It does
Mhm.
seem very narcissistic and uh, psychopathic.
Yes. Yes. And just also throughout my research, I'd found times in Pataki's past where he was arrested for, disorderly conduct, some violent behavior. I think there were some domestic violence issues, nothing of a grand scale, but, just to kind of document a little bit of maybe a history of anger or violent behavior. I thought it was worth at least including in the
Mhm.
book. And, you could draw your own conclusions if that equates what it does. But there's a little
Very
bit of a history
interesting.
there. He has a poem he wrote called Vodka Roulette, Seen as Relief Possibility. And so he writes, while I'm spilling my guts, she is driving me nuts. Please fetch us 2 drinks on the run. Just skip all the noise and make one of them poison and don't even tell me which one. So I don't know. It's an odd poem. I guess I find the fact that he was obviously involved with the CIA to be a little more of, to me, a smoking gun than a poem on its own. But I think this is someone who would know how to poison a drink and do it in a way that would not leave behind evidence. I think that's very possible.
And that
And
was
maybe
probably what he was assigned to do. First of all, being involved with Dorothy, interested in the JFK, pumping her for information, pretending to
yeah,
be interested in her emotionally and sexually, and using her for that, and, and possibly also for information. He's actually just giving it away, isn't he, in a way? Why would he write it?
I mean, I think that's what kept him on our radar. Even when I didn't, like I said, had a plan to really do anything more with the story, maybe do another article someday, but not a book. I'm glad we kind of kept that documented because as we looked at some of these comments, they were maybe said offhand, but then you'd go, well, wait a minute, when did he say he was in Guatemala? Well, there was a political coup that year. Well, he didn't just go there. I mean, it was for, and then you'd kind of put some pieces together, maybe not even catching it at the time. Um, but, just going through all the voluminous information of his correspondence that, these things came out as some red flags, maybe, of potential guilt. And I know we haven't talked much about like Jim Garrison or Mark Lane. Dorothy knew both of them. They were kind of competitor investigators. And Ron Pataki told us he knew them too. In fact, he met them on a few different occasions. And we thought, why? You review movies and plays for a medium-sized newspaper in the Midwest. When would you have the need to go talk to the Orleans Parish District Attorney Jim Garrison or Mark Lane, who's defending Margarita Oswald and is a prominent lawyer? Why would you ever cross paths? I don't know.
That is
Part
very,
of the mystery.
very, very interesting and an interesting point. Yes. Why would he do that? Did he
Yeah.
know, do you think? Did he know Lee Harvey Oswald as well? Did he, in some kind of way, work with him? I mean, Oswald certainly said he was a patsy.
I didn't shoot anybody, sir. I haven't been told what I'm here for. Do you have a lawyer? No, sir, I don't. I'd like some legal representation. These police officers have not allowed me to have any. I don't know what this is all about.
Kill the president?
No, sir, I didn't. People keep asking me that. Sir?
Shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man! Did you shoot the president?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
And you know, that's another thing with the book too, and I know it's hard to explore a lot of different elements, but I definitely go into some detail about how I think just what has come out shows that Oswald was likely intelligence. I think he was working for CIA. You know, he had a very high security clearance for an alleged defector. There are just some things about Oswald that I think he was the perfect fall guy, maybe. And you have to realize that when he was picked up in the movie theater, there was really no evidence at the time that linked him to killing Kennedy. But they planted a wallet at the scene of Tippett's murder. And then bingo, now we got a connection. So it's almost like Officer Tippett had to be killed to kind of complete the circle of framing Oswald. I mean, I think he was very much framed. I mean, you even talking to, you know, the Parkland Hospital doctors, who I don't think had any kind of agenda, political agenda, they said they were told from immediately at the press conference to not talk about the president being shot from the front. They were accosted by Secret Service saying, don't ever say that again. Well, we already had all the facts at that point. You know, a couple hours after the assassination, they knew everything. Really? They had the whole story lined up? I think because they had it lined up before the assassination even happened.
And they also staged Jack Ruby and him assassinating Oswald on television, live television, didn't they? I mean, who was he? I mean, I think Dorothy, she was the only one who was allowed to, or invited by him himself maybe to interview him, right?
Well, and I think you have to kind of keep in mind, Dorothy was kind of a celebrity. You know, in Jack Ruby's Carousel Club, they'd watch What's My Line? And they'd be like, shh, Dorothy's on, you know? So I think he was kind of a fan and was flattered. And I think that's how she was able to kind of get that in. Obviously, Melvin Belli and Joe Tonahill, the co-counsel, respected Dorothy, probably kind of admired her too, and facilitated those conversations. And I think that may have gotten some momentum going with where kind of Dorothy started to probe. I would think he gave her some information. I don't know the total extent of it, but he obviously had organized crime connections. Melvin Belli was a mobster lawyer. He was not a criminal defense lawyer. Clearly, I mean, Jack Ruby got the death penalty, so he obviously wasn't a very good attorney and for that type of crime. So I think, and as Dorothy wrote, she said, you know, as I've covered trials, she said, you know, I've covered murder trials. And as you got to know the character of, you know, the accused killer, you got to know the character of the victim. And she felt like, had there been a trial, we'd know more about the Ruby Oswald connection. Did they know each other? Who did he work for? That they would connect. And I think she felt like when Oswald was killed, that put an immediate stop to the investigation, a potential court trial where stuff may have come out. I think she felt like Oswald was silenced. And the key to that was Jack Ruby, that it wasn't just some, you know, vigilante justice, spur of the moment, you know, what they were trying to make it out to be, that Ruby was a part of the plot too, likely.
And of course, she was even more interested in covering this case, and she would have been anyway, but because she had become a friend of John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, and I think something to keep in mind is, you know, Dorothy was Irish Catholic. That's also my background. And so I think for a lot of people, her family, my family, it was probably a big deal to have a Catholic president for the first time. You know, there was obviously a lot of prejudice. There was a lot of excitement. And I think that could have been part of it. I don't know how much she was necessarily interested in his policies per se. I think Dorothy was a bit of a moderate. Um, but I think there is a connection because of that Irish Catholic heritage. And then, you know, about a year prior, JFK had taken her on a very gracious tour of the White House with her young son, Kerry. And I think she was just very struck by the leader of the free world listening to her little boy talk and ask questions and in such a human kind of way that I think it kind of became personal a little bit.
It became personal, certainly,
Yeah.
but wasn't she a Republican? She was certainly involved, and this is a very dark chapter, I would have to suggest. She was involved, or she supported the Joseph McCarthy hearings and the communist witch hunt in Hollywood, where lots of people were also well, accused of being a
Mhm.
communist and had to go into exile, even though they
Yeah.
weren't. And there was this paranoia going on in the world at that time, huh?
And I think it's kind of interesting because as far as I've seen, I haven't really seen Dorothy be very like defending a McCarthy, but she was very critical of Castro. She was very anti-Castro, anti-Khrushchev, and even would write columns about how has the government fallen for this? This is not going to be a good regime. That's how the Jack Parr feud had begun. Parr was very flattering, complimentary of Castro, and she criticized that, and thus began their feud. So I don't know if she was so much kind of a communist witch hunter as she was just very anti-communism in general and kind of who the government was communicating with, supporting different rulers we were backing. She seemed to have a lot of very geopolitical interests, not just confined to US politics, just seemed very interested in what was going on in like Latin America, obviously Cold War issues. Yeah, so I don't know if I could quite say, Hedda Hopper was very, she was quite a cold warrior. I mean, she was naming names and she was very involved in the witch hunts. I don't see that as much of Dorothy. I see that more of just very critical of Castro and just very anti-US working with him. She just did not trust him. And of course, some of that proved to be accurate, I guess you could say.
Hmm. So there was another Pataki um, poem that is also pretty eye-opening that I think we should also include.
This other poem I think you were talking about is called Never Trust a Stiff at a Typewriter. Yes. Okay. So I kind of more paraphrase of it. He said, quote, there's a way to quench a gossip stench that never fails. One cannot write if zippered tight, and that someone who's dead can sell no tales. And so some people see these lines as kind of a chilling reference to how Dorothy died. But he told our magazine that he's written over 2,000 poems and that, we're taking it out of context. Those, ones that I read. That, you know, we all kind of just
Well,
write about those kind of things.
well, it's pretty obvious, don't you think?
Well, I think that's why it's been hard to kind of let this story go because there are these loose ends.
Do you think that Ron Pataki knew that he was secured in a way that whatever what was in his,
Mhm.
whoever was protecting him would always make sure that he would be secured even to his dying day, and that's why he would not be prosecuted. The case will not be reopened, and he could be a little bit laissez-faire, a French word for not real. It's charming and a bit conniving about it when he spoke to you and your father and other authors.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I don't know why you would want to keep talking to someone who was kind of poking the bear a little bit, asking questions and probing, unless you felt like, what's going to happen?
Mhm. So what now? Now you have this book out, The
Mhm.
Incredible Life and Mysterious Death of Dorothy Kilgallen. Yes, do hold that book up a
Is
bit.
that okay? Yeah.
And it seems like a pretty big book.
It's a little over 400 pages. And one thing I was glad to do that you don't see in every book is putting photos within the text, kind of real time. Like I love this one. Woman columnist gets Jack Ruby's testimony. If that isn't sexist, I don't know what is. Eye roll. Um,
Well, today you would never write it, but at that time,
no,
who was a woman columnist talking about it? I mean, mostly they were Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, and they were only in Hollywood, basically, weren't they? I mean, doing
yeah,
these gossips, this cinema stuff, which Dorothy did as well in
yeah.
theater. But still, they were like the only ones, but you did not see a woman in that field at that time. It just wasn't the time when you're interested in the past as well, looking at the old films and the old film stars and everybody appearing on What's My Line. I mean, that era was totally different. But there's also an amazing charm and something wonderful about that era. People were very courteous and they had great manners and they spoke properly. Everything was different at that time, and which the world totally lacks today. Don't you agree?
Well, and I think a lot of people, especially kind of maybe my parents' generation, baby boomer generation, feel like that loss of innocence was very much after Kennedy was assassinated, that you can maybe even draw a line there um, of just things being different, like a little less civility, a little less kindness, less optimism. And, we sank, this country sank deeper into the Vietnam War, and then we had Watergate, and then Gerald Ford became president, he was on the Warren Commission, and okay, things
But
just kind
also
of
in
went
the
from there.
60s, it changed the world in terms of the racial barrier and the women's liberation and the youth rebellion that happened at that time, which was also fascinating. The 60s really changed the world, didn't it?
I mean, I think so. And I think, some people maybe think Dorothy was a bit old-fashioned on some things, maybe wasn't quite totally up on that. But, she also very famously testified during Lenny Bruce's obscenity hearings and called for free speech. And we know what he said in his stand-up act was should be allowed, to go. And yet was critical of some other types of literature or um, comedians, or I don't know. Maybe she was a bit of a crossroads herself, that she thought something was maybe a little tacky, or she didn't like, swear words, but she understood that there was merit to people like Lenny Bruce, who were telling it like it is, had a certain way of talking or representing, so there's a little
Dorothy
complexity there.
certainly must have been an advocate for freedom of speech. That was what she was fighting for, and she fought for it
Mhm.
all the time. And
Mhm.
she certainly was a groundbreaker in a way. But it seems like these days, it's like freedom of speech is being challenged. We cannot just say what we feel. Everybody's being offended, and there's this whole woke thing where you have to be so careful. I mean, I don't know. What would somebody like um, Joan Rivers and all of these great comedians who sadly is not with us anymore, George Carlin,
Mhm.
what would they do today? I mean, they would certainly point out all of these things that were necessary always, and you can use humor for that. But these days, it would be seen as being where people be offended and politically incorrect. There's become this very difficult political correctness narrative going on in the world where people have to be afraid and paranoid with what they think and what they do.
I mean, I think that that's definitely going on, and it certainly, I think, has evolved. I mean, like I said, when Dorothy was writing things that maybe were considered offensive then, we would kind of just, maybe in a kid's show today, they would not be, they'd be very mainstream, maybe. So, maybe generational change, differences impact what we see as offensive or what we deem as politically incorrect. But I think when you are a journalist, and I think journalism was Dorothy's main love. She had radio and television, but that's why I really focus on Dorothy's journalism career. I think as a journalist, you understand that you have a responsibility to find the truth and be fair about that, and that censorship doesn't have any place in a free society.
But we see that happening all the time, also with the Associated Press and everybody, all of the media. I mean, we also know from CNN and from Fox News that Fox is Republican and that's propaganda, and CNN is well Democrat and Democratic propaganda. So it's biased. It's not just searching for the truth and having a varied perspective on what is going on.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those kind of cable news networks, definitely have a bias. I mean, I'm certainly more of a public radio, public television. I'm critical of some parts of the mainstream media, and primarily because the cover-up continues today on the JFK assassination. I mean, it's very lockstep of maybe someone like me would get on for a 10-minute spot and they'd never talk about it again.
Exactly. That's what's happening with the JFK legendary case, and it's also happening with current events. So
Mhm.
so do we really have freedom of speech and a free press? I kind of doubt it. But I mean, your book here, which is you've put a lot of effort into it, what would you like to see come from this? What is your main mission with this book here in our remaining moments?
My mission. That's a great question. I think first and foremost to tell Dorothy's story. I'm 33 years old. A lot of people my age don't know Dorothy. I think that alone is a crime that people don't know Dorothy. I want people to know her as a writer, as a journalist, a glass ceiling breaker, a devoted mother, a great conversationalist, a style icon. There's so much about Dorothy that people need to know about. And of course, I'd like to see some movement in terms of justice for her death. Like I said, I don't think there'll be a day in court because who's left? But I think there could definitely be um, a public acknowledgement that she was killed. I think that would be a very huge step in the right direction.
Great. And do you have any final words for our viewers?
Well, I just really appreciate this opportunity to be on your show. And, there's so much, to delve into. I mean, I guess I hope people pick up the book, learn more about just what a wonderful writer Dorothy was. She created what I call word pictures. She was just a really talented woman who faced a lot of sexism and bigotry and just constantly went up against people who were trying to take her down a notch. And she was just this little gal, very petite, kind of this fashionista, and yet she had, the sword, they say that the pen is mightier than the sword. And I think she really took that up, that, she wasn't a very intimidating person, but I think she felt like that power, much like I feel like, is in your writing. Like that is the way that you can express yourself. I have this story inside me, I want to tell it. And I think that was Dorothy at the core, that she wanted to tell, the truth about different things and was just a really wonderful storyteller, even on things that were kind of just, movie star interests and Hollywood interests. Could just be so fascinating too.
And she was probably and sadly silenced for searching for that truth and wanting it to come out. So, I
Mhm.
mean, there's a lot of research that people can do here, and there's a lot of stuff to read about Dorothy, the incredible life and mysterious death of Dorothy Kilgallen. How can people obtain a copy, purchase your book?
Sure. It's on Amazon. I have it as a paperback and a newly launched ebook, an e-version, and those will be on some other platforms soon in the coming weeks. And then my publisher's website, pageturnerbooks.biz. That's fun because if you order from there, I can sign the copy to you. A nice personal message makes a great gift.
How absolutely wonderful. It's been really exciting, very interesting and fascinating to have this conversation with
Mhm.
you today about Dorothy Kilgallen. What a legendary figure, and it's very profound, and people have to look into it. And I just want to thank you so much for being on my show, Sarah Jordan Hines.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much to Sarah Jordan Hines, and thanks to all of you for watching my show, The Lucas Alexander Show. Please like my video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the bell for notifications. Your support is very appreciated. And I'll be back on the channel with more interesting topics and interesting guests very soon. Thank you so much for watching.